All right. So for those of you that are watching this recording now, just keep in mind that the very last 10 minutes, I'll be answering questions about assignments or material that we've covered. So watch till the end. And if you just wanted to fast forward to the end, you can do that too. I don't really care. You in your own home, doesn't matter to me what you do. Having said that, I have put a kind of suggested reading schedule, giving you a suggested reading schedule to make sure you get through the whole book. I would kind of follow that. Now today we're going to actually start in chapter 1, and I'm going to go like until I've got slides right now until chapter 5. Might not get to chapter 5. I don't know. We might. Who knows? I've actually put those slides up on Moodle today. I just did it this morning. So if you want those slides, you can grab them. What I typically do in this class is talk about the most practical things we can talk about in the class, and not necessarily like just get bogged down into the text. And so that's what I try to do. But like I said before, if you ever have a question about anything we're talking about, please don't hesitate to ask. Okay. All right. Okay. My system's running a little slow because I'm trying to get this. There we go. All right. Go. Let me tell you a couple of things about me. I'm Chris Bedard. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I got my marriage and family therapy degree from Abilene Christian. And I was actually a youth pastor before that for about 15 years before. And so I've worked with families, teenagers, individuals for almost 26 years now, whether it's in a church context or a clinical context. Sometimes that's exactly the same, and sometimes it's exactly opposite. I have my PhD from Texas Tech University, and I have mainly been working with couples over the last 7 or 8 years, almost specifically. Probably 85 or 90% of my clients are couples. When COVID came along, I lost about 80% of my clients just because we stopped meeting in person. So I've started meeting telehealth. So I've been doing telehealth or virtual sessions since then. So I've been doing virtual for a couple of years now. And so, which sounds weird when I say that, and I work with couples and people always want to know how I do it. I think if I hadn't been working with couples for so long, it'd be really hard to do, but it works for me. So I actually see couples all over the state. And so I've been doing that for a little while. In terms of this class, in terms of professional counseling, it's kind of interesting because I teach this class, Lifespan, Counseling Assessment, a couple of other ones. And then I teach the Practicum 2 class that you would have me like your last class. So I teach that as well. So I kind of get to see people at the beginning, and then I get to see everyone at the end. It's kind of neat to see that. So this is definitely a foundational class for you professionally. And so I'm going to do my best to hit as many, important areas as I can. Keeping in mind that, there's going to be a lot of changes, even in certain associations. There's going to be some changes that are going to take place because of COVID. So a lot of the information in the book, some of it might be changed a little bit just because of COVID. For example, the idea behind teletherapy, just a brief history there. Insurance companies used to not cover teletherapy at all unless you lived in a rural area. Now it's covered universally, and that's actually, they just approved it to be covered 6 more months. And so right now they're actually, most state governments are kind of leaning on insurance companies to cover it indefinitely, but that used to not happen. So that's going to be a change. There's going to be nuanced changes that are going to happen in the profession like that because of COVID. But in general, the things that you read in the text is the most up-to-date information that we have. And so that's what we're going to use for this class. There are, as you can tell, no exams for the class. You're welcome for that. And there's no, major papers. You're welcome for that. Now there are those assignments, and the assignments are there's a lot to them. but it's not anything that you can't handle. And like I said, I'll talk about any questions you have about those when we get to the back end. All right. So let's get going here. I'm going to share my screen. And when we do, let me make it bigger here for you. So this looks huge on, I've got a huge monitor, so it looks big on my screen, but it might not look big on yours. So if you'd like for it to be a little bigger, just shout out or put it in the chat. I got everything rearranged. Here we go. Okay. So we're going to talk about, we're going to start in chapter 1, and I'll probably skip some stuff in the PowerPoints, but I've given you this information in the PowerPoints to kind of help consolidate some of the things that you're reading, just so you can have it. I try my best to hit every learning style that we have. So some people are real visual, so they like to have the PowerPoint. Some people are not, they're auditory. They want to just hear, and that's great. And I'm going to do that too, because I can talk. I can talk with the best of them, but I want to have some discussion too with you guys, because some people learn through processing verbally too. So we're going to try to do all of those things together as we go through. And so when we start thinking about the idea of professional counseling, one of the things I'm curious about as we start, and you can do this by raising your hand or putting up an icon. How many of you are doing the LPC, like going the LPC track? All right, quite a few. Anyone doing the LMFT? Okay, couple people. Do we have any school counseling folks? Okay. Is anyone doing both? Anyone doing both LMFT and LPC together?
So that's my plan. I originally started with LMFT and then decided I needed to go back to LPC, but they technically, I don't think they'll let us do them at the same time, but pretty much back to back.
Yeah. So there's there's a conjoint degree that you can do now.
Okay.
That just started, but it depends on when you started the program as to when you can start it. So,
okay, I'll check that out. Thanks.
Yeah, you can check it out. So that's kind of new, kind of a new thing that we offer. That there's just a difference in classes that you take. So I'm always curious to see which, so it looks like the majority of folks are going to LPC, which is fine. There's pros and cons to doing LPC versus LMFT. Basically, when it's all said and done, this is a terminal degree for you in terms of what you can do with clients. Like, in other words, once you get a master's, you can see clients and bill and all those things. You don't have to get anything further if you don't want to. The only reason that people would go on and get maybe a doctor of psychology or a PhD would be if you wanted to teach. That's most of the reason why people do that. Otherwise, this is terminal for you guys. So everything you do from here on is going to help you professionally. So at the end of it, when it's all said and done, you'll be a licensed whatever, fill in the blank, right? Licensed professional counselor, licensed marriage and family therapist. The actual term LPC is changing to professional counselor. And I think we're actually going to change it here at Amberton as well. And you'll see that in some of the state forms that are out there now. All right. Okay. So I'm just going to throw up a couple of lists here for you to see. There's actually quite a few counselors, if we look at it broadly. Technically speaking, marriage, couple, and family counselors are typically actually called therapists. Now, why is that? I really don't know a great answer. I've always learned therapy, for me, my training was more, I help people find the answers that are already inside of them and walk beside them and help them. Counseling traditionally has been maybe sometimes giving some suggestions or not advice, but maybe like wisdom kind of thing, like traditionally speaking. But in general, we basically do the same thing, right? We don't make personal decisions for people. We help them figure things out for themselves, and we don't tell them what to do, basically. No one really does that in this profession. If you're going to want to tell someone what to do, this is probably not the greatest profession for you. I'm not saying you can't do that, and some people do. Some mental health practitioners do tell people what to do, and you can do that. Personally, I think that's a lot of pressure, Because what if you tell them the wrong thing? Then that's probably not great. So when we think about counselors, this is kind of just some of the areas of counseling, and all of these areas of counseling, some of these don't have to have like a state license necessarily. Some of them do. And again, all of these things are in your book. I'm just kind of highlighting a couple of things just to have general knowledge. These are some of the divisions or associations that you can be a part of. As you go through, like there's different branches even of American Counseling Association. Texas has its own branch. Texas has its own branch of Texas Counseling Association and Texas Marriage and Family Therapy Association. And there's nationwide branches as well. So like when you go down the LPC route, you can have a Texas and a national. Same thing with LMFT. And you can see some of the benefits of being with the ACA in the text as well. There are some benefits to it that you can read about too. Here, this is something I wish I would have had when I first started. When I first started, they would throw out all these things like AAMFT and TCA, and I was like, what in the world are you guys talking about? So this is a good kind of a glossary of definitions of all these letters that we throw out. Some of you might already know this. That's great. Some people might not know this. And so, and again, this is all in the book, but these are just kind of general things to know when it comes to knowing what some of these associations are. All right. Yep. Somebody's got a question. I think Amara, if you're talking, just make sure you unmute yourself too. All right, I'm going to keep going. Now today, I'm going to focus on a couple of different areas. One area is just kind of fundamental information about the professional counseling world. The other area that we're going to talk about today, that we're going to talk about the next two classes as well, are things like techniques and just in general, because you're going to take a whole other class for that. Just general techniques and kind of ways to go about counseling, and what is it like, for example, in this particular slide, like what does empathy mean? What does acceptance mean? Why do we talk about genuineness? All of those things. We're going to talk about these 9 common factors this morning specifically. And then we're going to spend some time talking about how to use them. In other words, if I'm doing CBT, what does that look like with some of these common factors? If I'm doing solution-focused therapy, what does that look like? What the heck is solution-focused therapy? What is cognitive behavioral therapy? We're going to talk about some of those things as we kind of go through. This is where I will tend to maybe go a little fast through some of the information. So if I go too fast, just tell me and I'll slow down, and we can always go back. Okay. I've got enough slides to cover about 4 hours. We're not going to go that long, but I wanted to have enough information to make the class really good for you guys. So just make sure that if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. Okay. All right. So let's talk about some of these factors. Now, the first one, the kind of having empathy, acceptance, and genuineness, those 3 are super foundational when we talk about counseling. Probably the one that's missed that I always bring up in all my classes. So if you've had me before, I've said this before. If you don't like people, this is not your profession. That's kind of important because you don't always have to agree with people. You don't have to side with people, but like caring about people and wanting to help people and liking people is kind of important in this profession. The reason why that's important is because it's really, 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 really hard to have empathy when you're like, don't like people or you're not trying to help. Because one of the first things you're going to try to do with empathy is take their perspective. So perspective taking is super important. being able to join with them emotionally while still having a boundary, obviously, for yourself is another really important thing. Okay. And I've put a video, Brene Brown's video about empathy is on Moodle. It's probably the best definition of empathy I've ever seen. I actually show it to my clients, especially my couples. Now, Rogers talks about, Carl Rogers is the one that kind of talked about this empathy, genuineness, positive self-regard, warmth. He's the one that talked about it originally. And you can do a whole session just using those three things. You can always just do that too. But empathy is really important, but it really starts with kind of liking people and caring about them. That's kind of important to our profession. The great thing about empathy, which we're going to talk basically about all of these all the way through, but the great thing about empathy is it's skill based. You can learn how to do it. There's a lot of research that's done on empathy. One of the cool studies that's out there is from a group in the UK. They do work with adolescents, and they did several different experiments, and they had functional MRIs going with the students too. And so they kind of combined their information, and they found out that adolescents can basically take another person's perspective around 19 to 22% of the time, which is pretty good. Sometimes on the lower end, maybe more like 16, but on the high end was 22. What they found with adults was it didn't quite double. So it was more like 35%. That says a lot about us as adults, that we're not always good at it. But what it tells us is there's room for growth. In other words, we can learn how to do it better. Like it's a skill that we can build. So as we talk about these characteristics, for the most part, these are skills that we're going to build on. So having acceptance, or sometimes it's called positive regard, that's what Rogers calls it. It's foundational to the alliance. In other words, no matter what they're talking about, there's a respect that you're showing with your client. And there's a positive regard that you're showing with your client. There's an acceptance of them that you're showing. And your clients can typically tell if you're not doing that. I mean, most of the time you can tell as a person if someone's listening, but they don't respect what you're saying, or they don't accept you, right? And again, it doesn't mean you always agree. I'm just saying you're basically taking your judgment and setting it to the side. And all you're doing is listening and accepting the things that they're saying. Now, we're going to talk about later, how do we use that to help them see something that might be false that they're thinking, like if we have a cognitive distortion, let's say, how do we take this and go, hey, what about this? We'll talk about that in a little bit. But basically, when we have acceptance, we have this kind of no strings attached approach. When we talk about genuineness, it's exactly what it's talking about: authentic, honest, and open, and you're trying to help. And that's literally what it's about. They talk about this, and all these are talked about quite a bit in the book, especially early on in the first chapter. I feel like this is the first chapter. I might go into the second chapter. One of the interesting things about genuineness is this third bullet. Research on genuineness shows that it may be super important with outcomes when it comes to working with clients. So what does that mean? It might mean that you are being real with them, and you're the only person that is, or that ever has been, let's say. It might mean that, like it says here, that this could be related to emotional intelligence, which means you're able to kind of monitor where you are emotionally as you're working with someone and still remain authentic with them, which again is a skill that you can learn, and it's something that you practice and learn and develop over time. So that the more you work with clients, the more you're able to do that with them. Okay. This wellness perspective, I could talk about this for about an hour. If someone that's been in mental health during COVID, it has been super trying for a lot of us. There's been a lot of burnout in mental health because of COVID, because basically we're kind of like listening and giving and helping and And unfortunately, traditionally, we're not great at asking for help for ourselves. And we're not always great with boundaries for ourselves. And that's really a problem. This happened to me last fall. I just kind of hit a wall and had to kind of take a step back and take a break and step away, because I was kind of blowing and going because I got super busy, and which is great, but it's also not great if you're not taking care of yourself. So this idea of having this perspective of wellness is really important. So like having your own therapist, and I talked about this in another class recently, even having other colleagues that you can talk about or talk with that kind of understand what you're going through, that also helps as well. Cultural competence, this is something we're going to talk about throughout. The idea of being culturally competent now is more important now more than ever, mainly because the idea that we know everything about a culture is not correct, right? As you go through your training, you're going to take a cultural class, a class on culture and diversity. So you're going to learn different aspects of different cultures. So you'll have some information about certain cultures, how they operate, and things like that. You're going to learn information. That's great. But to say that you know their experience is not true. So cultural competence is actually knowing what you don't know and making that client the expert of their culture and of their cultural experience. It's super helpful to know information about different cultures that you might work with, but it's also important to know what you don't know and allow them to tell you those things and just become really curious with them about their cultural experience. I had to learn that the hard way when I first started, just like a lot of us do, because sometimes you're just not thinking about it. And so it's really important that we kind of look at cultural competence as one of those, like it says, one of those characteristics. It's kind of a tool that we have to use. This is just kind of a anagram here that, and again, it's in the book, but this kind of respectful model. These are all aspects of someone's culture that they could be experiencing or have gone through or currently going through. And it's something that you can always kind of think about as you're working with people and talking with people. A couple of the things that we may not always think about when we're working with people is things like economic class, socioeconomic background. We don't always think about that necessarily. Sexual identity, we don't necessarily always think about that at the beginning. The idea of trauma, there are a high number of clients that we would have, high number as in 100% of people have gone through a trauma of some kind. You don't have to go through major, huge trauma to have trauma. For example, we've all gone through a fairly large trauma in the last couple of years with COVID. COVID's basically one large, long trauma that we've all experienced, we're all going through. Some people have more traumatic experiences from their background maybe than other people. And so that's one thing that we don't typically think about. Family background and history, kind of sometimes we think about that a lot of times. Location of residence and language differences. If someone's moved here and English wasn't their first language, let's say when they moved here, that's something to think about. There's just different areas that we can think about that we can just ask about and become curious about. And that will help us to understand our clients better. I'm going to talk about some of these later. This idea of theory is important. You're going to spend a lot of time in this program thinking through, like, is there a theory that you've come across, a model of therapy that you've come across that resonates with you, that's something you think, hey, this is the theory and the model I like as a therapist, and I'm going to use this. And then you kind of develop your style around that. So this idea of finding a theory is really important. I think if you find something that also fits your personality style, that helps a lot. For example, I'm pretty laid back and pretty, I'm not really a type A kind of personality style. So for me, I've always kind of gravitated towards more of the postmodern kind of, I'm a non-expert, like my client's the expert. So I've always kind of gravitated towards those types of therapy models. And that, because that fits my personality versus more the kind of the modern styles of therapy have always more been, the therapist kind of in charge, kind of the expert, kind of the structure. They kind of make things happen. It doesn't mean that I don't do that from time to time, because sometimes I do, but in general, I'm pretty laid back. And so I work really well. This sounds really strange, but because of my personality style, I typically work really well in crisis. I work really well with people that are going through really hard things at the time. I work really well when people are escalated. That's probably why I work well with couples, because I can kind of be unescalated or de-escalated myself and help them to de-escalate. So I gravitate towards that because that's kind of my personality. That might not be all of your personality. So you kind of have to figure out your personality style and the kind of theory that resonates with you. Here's the great thing. We know from outcome research or outcome studies, if you choose a model, like some of you are like, hey, I'm going to be CBT, that's it. Awesome. Some of you say, no, I'm going to be a narrative therapist. Or some of you say, no, I'm going to do solution focused. If you believe in it and you know it and you use it and it's what you believe in, all three of those will have exactly the same great results. It doesn't matter the model, it matters what you believe. In other words, if I'm a CBT guy, and I believe in it, but I'm going to try to do narrative, but I'm like, I'm going to try it. Maybe it's not going to work. Right. It doesn't mean you shouldn't try it, but it means the longer you do it, the more you go, oh, this isn't for me. And then you keep doing it. It's not going to work for you. Does that make sense? Whatever model you kind of resonate with your personality and what you start doing, is really what you'll figure all this out. You'll figure all this out. I encourage students to try different things. When you get to your practicum, you can try different things. You can try different models and see which ones work for you. But you have to give it a good try, and see. But sometimes people get to the practicum and they kind of know what they want to do and they've already zeroed in on it. That's fine too. It really is about your personality and the theory and kind of what fits with you. Competence. It seems like we shouldn't have to say this, but being competent as a counselor or therapist is really important. So having a mastery in whatever area you're trying to be in. Mastery is kind of a weird word. We're always mastering something, right? We're in the process of getting better, right? As a therapist, I've been doing it for a little while. I can always get better. I can always grow. I can always do something better. I can always have a session and look back on it and go, oh, that session was pretty good, but I wish I would have done these things or said this or asked this question, kind of thing. If you have if you feel incompetent, a lot of times clients can sense that, like, hey, you're not really doing really well. And unfortunately, sometimes they'll change therapists and they'll talk about that therapist with you and say, I was going to this person, but they didn't really do anything. They didn't say anything. This sounds horrible, but I've had clients come to me from other counselors and literally say, like, they fell asleep during my session, kind of stuff, which kind of sounds like that shouldn't happen, but that happens. And it's unfortunate. But our competence is really important. So one of the things that we try to do, one of the reasons why we have continuing education that we all have to do is because of this, to remain competent, up on our field, trying to understand any changes in our field, better ways to do things in our field, because our world's changing. And it's not going to slow down. It's going to keep changing. So to remain competent means we have to continue to grow and learn and develop. This ethical code, I don't know if this might be in the back of your book. It might be in the chapter. This code, we're going to talk about ethics kind of in a separate class, and you're going to have a whole separate ethics class that you will take where you'll dive into a lot of these things. But just kind of knowing ethics are our principles that govern our professional life. They're not laws. Laws are the legal things that govern our world. ethics are the things, the code that are the guidelines for our practice. I think this idea that we think critically, I think this one's really important. So let me take a step back for a second, because I'm just kind of curious. And this is like a free discussion, okay? So I'm not necessarily looking for like the answer. I'm just kind of curious. Because a lot of times when we talk about being a counselor or a therapist, we don't necessarily, like, critical thinking doesn't necessarily like jump into our brains. But this idea of critical thinking as a counselor, tell me what you think that means. What do you think about that? I'm asking you to do critical thinking right now. I'm kind of putting you on the spot. What do you think critical thinking as a counselor, what would that be? What would that look like to you?
Interrogating your practice.
Interrogating. Okay, tell me what that means. That's good. That sounds like interrogating sounds ominous. Talk to me about that.
It does have an ominous or negative connotation sometimes, but I think mainly it just means asking questions about what it is that you're doing and whether or not it's effective.
Okay, so kind of that critical interrogation of yourself.
Yeah. I'm a former teacher, and we do a lot of I did a lot of metacognition stuff where I talk about, okay, so you did this thing. What was your decision-making process? Why did you do it that way?
Right. Metacognition is such a great skill. Yeah, and it's actually executive function too. So that's great. Yeah. So being able to kind of question what we did, what we said, how it worked or didn't work, kind of thing. That's good. Anyone else?
I have just really one thing to say. I think it's interesting that I read about that you're willing. It seems like you're more adaptable to change and considering other theories, viewpoints, and trying to see where you can improve.
Yeah. So adaptability is a hallmark of critical thinking. It doesn't mean you give up your belief system per se. It means you have an open-mindedness too. So like kind of what you're saying, like this ability to adapt and be open.
That can be hard to do sometimes.
It can be very hard. Absolutely. It's hard for adults. It's easy for kids. It's hard for adults.
So I think I was able to use this on like a level with, I'm in multicultural counseling as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you think about critical thinking, you think about critiquing your own ideas and belief systems. And that's something that, as you look at adaptability and so forth, especially with multicultural counseling, you really have to examine your thoughts and your beliefs. And you're right, that adaptability is so important. So yeah, that's kind of what it means to me.
Absolutely. So I hear a lot of it. I hear a lot of you, and you might all be thinking this ability to look inside your own thoughts and beliefs and kind of not necessarily question as much as be curious about. Those are different, right? Like questioning something and being curious about something can be a little bit different. We don't have to always question everything, but we can be curious about something. Like having a wonder, right? Like I wonder what this is about, or I wonder where this comes from, or where was this going, kind of thing. That's good. That's good. Now, Krister, I don't know where you're at, if you can talk about this, but you have a really good comment if you want to elaborate. I'd love for you to, if you're in a place to do that.
So I'm on the road, so I apologize. I was just thinking about, like in any helping relationship, the story that we receive is one perspective.
Yeah.
Usually it's a very particular perspective, but it's not it's not the totality of what is really happening.
Right.
So I think part of critical thinking is to be trusting. I think it's also to be cognizant that we're also getting a very tailored view of something.
Right.
How do you figure out how to hold that balance?
Right.
Challenging and accepting at the same time.
Right. So here's what you're bringing up is like one of the things that you will live inside. Like you're hearing a perspective from someone. And by the way, for those of you that want to work with couples or families, you could hear 4 perspectives and they could all be different because it's their perspective. So how do you keep it that and honor each one, right? Like how do you keep each one and honor each one while also trying to help, and whatever help means, right? Like whatever that help looks like. How do you do that? And so one of the things about critical thinking, and again, this is partly from my experience, but partly from the things that you can, like in terms of research, like looking at what research says about this. One of the things that it's important to remember is that we have tools that we can use to help our clients and help us understand and have a more clear picture, right? In other words, if I have 4 perspectives in front of me and I'm like, oh, these are different, which one's real? Which one's the truth? Which one's right, quote unquote? Well, to them, they're all right? They're all true. But I'm sitting here going, that they're all different. So what stops me as a counselor, as a therapist going, let me understand what you guys are saying. And then you just basically repeat back what you heard. This is a technique that I learned from this guy's Dr. Mendelbaum's in his 80s. He was around when Aaron Beck developed CBT, and he was part of his some of his original therapists that helped him develop it. He had this really cool little visual thing that he did that it helped me kind of understand different perspectives and repeat them back. He did this with a client live. I saw him do it, and it was really interesting. He said, on one hand, and he repeated whatever they said, this thing, but on the other hand, and he repeated and it showed this kind of juxtaposition or dichotomy between what was being said. And then that way it makes the client go, well, wait a minute, that sounds like, it makes them think, right? Like you're not telling them, hey, all y'all perspectives are different. Y'all need to figure this out. That's not going to work. It's this ability to kind of throw it back on them, but allow them to start thinking about, okay, wait a minute. Mom said this, dad said this, son said this, or whatever. Grandmother said, I've had grandparents. They said, in other words, I heard this, but then on the other hand, I heard this, but the other person was saying this. It allows them to kind of wrestle. Because who do we want to figure it out? Them, right? Not us. I can sit back and go, well, here's all 3. And I'll go, well, this one doesn't make sense. This one doesn't make sense. Maybe this one does. As a counselor, potentially, you could do that. Well, that's not helping them, right? Does that make sense? Now, I'm not saying that you can't directly point something out that doesn't make sense. You can do it, but there's a way that you can do it too. But this idea of critical thinking really is important. Really is important. Because we have to be able to think critically about the things that we're hearing and the things that we're taking in and the things that we're thinking and feeling in the room. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Okay. Let me go through a couple of other things here.
Excuse me.
Yeah. Sorry.
Could you say the full name of that doctor, please?
Yeah, it's Donald. Hang on a second. I'm gonna send it to you. Hang on a second. Hang on. I'm gonna send you it's Mendelsohn. Donald Mendelsohn. I feel like this guy's like 80. I feel like he's 80. I feel like he's 85. He's got a YouTube. He's got some YouTube stuff. If you just look up CBT Mendelsohn, it'll be in there. I just saw him do it live, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's like one of the best visual ways to help people kind of think through things. Anyway.
I think you said Mendelbaum the first time.
Yeah, I don't think I meant Mendelbaum. I think I meant Mendelsohn.
Mendelssohn. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Hang on a second. Let me get over here. Okay, yeah, this let me do a couple of other things here. Okay. So one of the things about the history and accreditation, I'm gonna you definitely need to read through those chapters. In terms of accreditation and credentialing, you guys are gonna as you go through, you're gonna learn a lot more about that. And especially once you get to pre-practicum in the program, that's when you learn the most about credentialing and licensing and things like that. The ethics part, there's a little bit of ethics in every chapter. We're going to talk about ethics in the third class, the third Zoom class. And so I'm going to spend most of my time on ethics in that way. And so just kind of reading through the history of the profession and kind of looking at it, where it's come from and where it is now. I just didn't want to spend a ton of time on that today. So what I want to do is talk about theories and models, and I'm going to do that for another 5 minutes. And then we're going to do a breakout group. I'm going to give you 2 or 3 things to talk about amongst yourselves. And then we're going to come back and I'm going to skip ahead to a couple of things so that I want to make sure I have time to talk about a couple of these things specifically. The reason why we talk about theories and models, and this is really important, is because it, like a theory, gives us some kind of framework to wrap our heads around something. Okay. Right before this, I was teaching a lifespan development class, and in that class, you get all these theories thrown at you about human development and lifespan development. The reason why we have a theory is because something happens or something's working or not working. We want to know why. So we first have a theory about it, and then we basically go on to see if that theory is right or plays out. And so one of the things about having a counseling theory is it should really drive our practice. Like we should have a theory that kind of drives us. And that's in 2 ways. You're going to learn throughout the program different theories of counseling, like a humanistic approach or experiential, or you can learn about attachment theory. You're going to learn about some models like CBT or solution focused or narrative, those kinds of things. But there's a second part of it that's also important. As you're in the room, you are also kind of developing your own theory about that case. Like you're listening to what someone's saying and you're hearing kind of the things they want to work on, and you're listening to whether it's their family life or their experience or some event they've gone through. You're also developing your own theory around what they're talking about. So when we combine those together, it's possible that you're hearing a theory about, and I'm making up situations, and I've had these situations where, well, I'm working with 2 or 3 folks right now that have really specific and really unhealthy cognitive distortions. In other words, they have like an always kind of thinking or a never kind of thinking, things like that, or catastrophic thinking is another one. Like, this is always going to be the worst, or think the worst thing's about to happen kind of thinking. And so we've been working specifically in CBT. So I learned CBT. I don't use it all the time, but I know CBT. And so my theory, as I'm sitting there with them going, hey, they need to change some of these cognitive distortions. So I'm going to use CBT with them. I'm going to work on these distortions specifically, versus I'm working with a couple or even an individual that's having trouble even like seeing their emotions and how their emotions are affecting them, or trying to figure out what to do with their emotions. Well, emotional focus therapy for me helps them do that. So I know I use EFT, so I can use EFT with this client because my theory kind of says, hey, maybe it's even emotional intelligence I need to kind of help them access these emotions and learn what these are or are not. So we talk about emotions and we bring them up, we work through them. So this idea behind having an overarching theory, like I'm going to resonate with this particular theory and model of therapy, is great. That's what you need to do. And you'll work on that throughout this whole program. And you'll write about it too. And when we're sitting across from people, we can also kind of have a theory about, hey, what's going on with them? And there's hundreds of counseling. I mean, there's an unending amount of theories for counseling. And there's always new ones all the time, right? So it's not like you can't learn things. We can always learn something. When I was going through my master's program and my PhD, DBT wasn't a thing at the time. And now it is. And I didn't know much about it, but now I'm learning about DBT because I didn't learn about it in school, right? So there's always new theories. There's hundreds of theories. Not all of them have gained prominence, and not all of them are evidence-based either. Some of them haven't gone through as much rigorous research as others. And that's one of the reasons why sometimes maybe they're not as recognized. There's these kind of different conceptual orientations. So psychodynamic approaches, existential, humanistic, cognitive behavioral, and postmodern. We're going to talk about a couple of these. We're not going to talk about all of them. When we talk about psychodynamics, you can think about Freud, and then you can think about Carl Jung. You can think those are the kind of the heavy hitters, and there's other people too. So this is along the lines of the kind of the psychological types with Jung. He was Freud was pretty pessimistic as a person, just in general. He's less pessimistic than Freud was. But he looks at this kind of unconscious too. And so basically from coming out of him was kind of this ability to ask questions to access the subconscious, like to bring it to the conscious, kind of what he really focused on. So how you ask questions really matters, which is super true for any of these approaches. How you ask questions matter. A really good question will always beat really good advice almost 100% of the time. If you can get a really good question and help people think, that's really, really important. Like I was talking about, making the unconscious conscious. He looked at dreams, symbols, different creative techniques, active imagination. And like I said, you guys can read more about that, and you'll read other information about him in other classes as well. When we talk about Alderian approaches, this idea of having these kind of subjective goals that results in development of behaviors that basically compensates for feeling of inferiority is kind of what he was going at. And so what he kind of try to help people do is work through behaviors and feelings of inferiority. I mean, he tried to help with kind of attention seeking and kind of like power, revenge seeking, inadequacy especially. And he was one of the more early humanistic type counselor or therapist. So his approach was kind of on that humanistic end of things. But when we get to existential or humanistic approaches, then Viktor Frankl is someone that jumps out. And if you've never read, Viktor Frankl has a great book. It's really short. It's called Man's Search for Meaning. It's how he developed logotherapy. It's incredible. He was a Holocaust survivor and doctor that basically wrote about human suffering, and basically kind of this idea, if we have a why, we can go through any how, is kind of his theory. And he kind of worked to show that. And so, which is kind of an existential kind of thing. And so then we get to person-centered, which is more the idea of having client-centered therapy. And Carl Rogers is really the one that really did that. And so having this idea, like I said before, of empathy and positive self-regard and warmth and genuineness. Kind of revolves around techniques that he developed to help clients can kind of gain a more realistic idea of their self. And so I would say that a lot of this person-centered approach seems to really resonate with a lot of students. He probably resonated with me the most as a student myself. And so then we've got CBT and, kind of started with classic conditioning, operant conditioning, social learning. I mean, kind of going through the years, modern day kind of behaviorism that ended up being what we now call CBT, which is from Aaron Beck. It's based on this idea that, it's kind of classical conditioning that we basically, our brains are wired a certain way and we can rewire them if we want to, but it takes work, but we can do it. Let's see. Let me stop. I'm going to stop. Postmodern. I'm going to come back to that one. Here's what I want to do. I want to stop there. Here's what I want to do. We're gonna get into groups, and I'm gonna put you in groups of 3 or 4. I try not to do more than 4. I like to do 3. Here's what I want you to do. The first thing is kind of like if we were in class, introduce yourselves to each other. That'd be nice. And talk about, hey, this is where I'm at in the program. This is my first class, 10th class. I'm going this track. And kind of look at that, talk about that. Nick, you're asking about the PowerPoint's on Moodle. I just put it up there this morning, so you can check that out. The second thing I want you guys to talk about is kind of what we're talking about right now in terms of style of therapy. I want you guys to talk to each other and kind of say, hey, I think I want to work with these clients and I want to work with them in this way. And you fill in the blank. That could mean what led me to be a counselor was this thing. And because of that, I want to do this. It's really, there's no like set answer. I want you to start thinking about, I want to work with these folks and I want to work with them in this way. And whatever that looks like. So you're going to introduce yourself to each other and talk about the kind of clients you want to work with, including, I don't know is an answer too. I'm not sure what I want to do, but I think I want to do this. If you don't know, it would be helpful to go, like if you told me that, I would say, well, what brought you to, why in the world did you sign up to pay money to take classes to become a counselor? What made you do that? Some of you already know the answer to that. Maybe some of you are still thinking about it. That's okay. It's no big deal. All right. So let's do those things. I'll give you about 10 minutes or so. I'm going to jump in and out of groups too. And so if you have any questions, I'll answer them. And then I'll give you like a 2-minute heads up when we're done. Right now, go back. Here we go. All right. So you'll get a little button pop on the screen. You'll just click that and you're off to the races. Go.
This meeting is being recorded.
Yes, it is. Okay. So I want to talk about a couple of different things and then have some discussion around them. Let me get this back up here. Screen share. Okay. My only complaint about Zoom. Every time I screen share, I can only see like one person. I like to see everybody, so I have to fix it every time. Okay, there we go. Hopefully everyone can see this. It's huge on my screen, but hopefully everyone can see it. Okay, all right. My last class, I got like a third of the way through the class and someone was like, hey, I can't see your screen. I was like, oh shoot, let's get that fixed. So one of the things that you'll learn, and some of you are in a theories class right now with Dr. Armstrong, and so some of this will be repetitive, and you'll learn this in other classes too. This idea of like postmodern social construction, postmodern or post-structuralism, those kind of get thrown around a little bit. And so one of the ways to think about it is in terms of like modernism. A lot of the approaches that were developed during like modernism are more kind of the therapist is the expert in the room kind of thing. The client's not necessarily the expert, really. They're more directive kinds of therapy. And so that happened for a long, long time. And there's also like assumptions and beliefs that were just taken for granted. For example, when a lot of these particular theories and models were developed was during, like in America especially, they were developed during a certain time in our history where there were really defined gender roles, let's say. You know, women did this, men did this, and kids did this. Like really super structured. Well, fast forward to today, that's not necessarily the case, right? So that's a difference in how to kind of look at those different forms. And so when we think about social construction, family, cultural, society, language has a lot to do with development, has a lot to do with who we are, has a lot to do with how we do things as a therapist. In terms of even, there's a model of therapy called collaborative language systems, CLS, that when you first read about it, you think, are you only having a conversation with someone and then they get better? Because that's what it looks like on the outside, but it's socially constructed and you do interventions in a way that you're actually having a dialogue with someone that's helping them to work through whatever issue they're working through in a dialogue. And so they call it, they kind of basically disappear, like whatever their goal, they reach their goal and something kind of disappears. It's kind of like having this conversation with them. That's on the far end of this postmodern social construction kind of thing, where language, the actual language that you use, is so important. When we look at what I call postmodernism, we fast forward to this idea that we're not the expert. The actual client is the expert of their life, right? They're the expert of their experience. They're the expert of their culture. They're the expert of you fill in the blank. They're the expert in the room. It doesn't mean that you're not an expert, quote unquote. It just means they're the expert of themselves. Whereas in modernity, it was opposite, right? The client's not the expert. They're there to get not told what to do, but to be instructed and be led and be directed, right? And those forms of therapy are still around, and those are fine. This kind of postmodernism is, we kind of started to question like certain truths or certain structures. Like I said, there were certain roles 50, 60 years ago that aren't necessarily there anymore. So we start to question some of those. And as those change and shift, we need to kind of change and shift how we do counseling and therapy with people, or how we think about those things. It doesn't mean that we don't have any structures or rules. It just means that there's a shift in those things. So there's two specific ones, and I think the book talks about a couple other ones, but these are two big approaches that came out of this kind of postmodern thought, and that's narrative therapy and solution focus. Brief therapy that came out of the school, and actually solution focused therapy, the founders of that came out of the Beck kind of school of thought, and especially Jung, they came out of his school of thought, where questions were really important. And so narrative therapy was a lot about questions, but also about kind of what it says there. We have a narrative of our life, and then we look at exceptions to when there wasn't a problem. So I want to talk about a couple of these with you as we go through them here. So narrative therapy, developed by White and Epstein. So our realities are socially constructed through language, and organized and maintained through narrative, through our story. So I'll give you an example of how this really works well. I've had clients that I would say are really good storytellers, like about their life. They can just remember, some people can just remember like almost every single thing that's ever happened to them. That's what it seems like. They can just remember all these things. And so they can kind of tell a story. But what happens inside the story that you're looking for is when they get kind of like bogged down into what's probably not true, but they think it's true of them or of their experience. And you start to point those things out, and you're kind of deconstructing the narrative. In other words, I could be doing a session with someone, they're telling me about this issue and this issue and this issue. And I might ask, hey, was there a time when that wasn't a problem? Or was there a time when that wasn't happening? We're starting to deconstruct their narrative in that instant, in that whatever that issue is, to point out exceptions to when it wasn't happening, which is basically kind of like a little bit of CBT, right? Where we're saying, hey, it doesn't always happen, right? There's a little bit of a negative cognition that's happening inside the story, and we point it out and we say, well, it didn't happen when this and this and this happened. So that's a way that you kind of start to deconstruct something and allow them to kind of retell the story in that particular issue. This sounds kind of it's one of those things where it's not as structured as like a CBT or where it's really more about whatever story they're creating. Okay, so that's one way. This kind of looking at thin and thick stories. Sometimes you want to thicken, like example, like if I want to thicken a resilient time in someone's life, let's say, I might want to bring that out and really point it out and really pull it out, really show, hey, this was really happening. You really did this well, kind of thing. Being curious, being respectful, asking questions, looking for patterns. A lot of times you'll use journaling, or you'll retell a story after you've kind of gone through it. A lot of times symbols are helpful. In other words, externalizing something, like give it a symbol, give it a name. Hey, this time of my life is called blank. You give it a name and talk about it in that way. To externalize something helps get something on the inside outside. So you can do things like that with them. Hopefully that makes sense. And there's tons of information. There's tons of literature about this. There's tons written about it. But again, this is on the more postmodern approach versus if we go back to cognitive types of therapy, it's a little different, right? That's when we're looking at some core beliefs, attitudes, rules that are cognitively the things that they're thinking. Doesn't mean that narrative therapy, you're not thinking cognitively or emotionally. But this is a very specific kind of thing where you're talking about these cognitive distortions specifically, or automatic thoughts specifically, talking about them specifically and bringing them up specifically. And you might even give homework about these certain triggers or thoughts. And the homework is designed to help you, first of all, see them, because sometimes we don't see it, right? We don't see when we're having a distortion. That's why you go to counseling. And so the homework helps bring that out so that your automatic thoughts, you can start see them, that they're automatic. And then you start to build new neural pathways around that automatic thought to create a more healthy automatic thought, so that your distortion is no longer a distortion. So if you think about those two models, those are a little different. Does that make sense? I mean, one of them is very kind of like stand back, curious, ask lots of questions. One of them is a little more direct, a little more directive, a little more like give homework, a little more, hey, let's dive into this particular thought and change it kind of thing. One of the narrative therapy is a little bit more, not standoffish, but allows them to kind of reach those things themselves. Both of them obviously are a little bit directed in terms of what you're doing in the session, but CBT traditionally has been a little bit more directive coming from the counselor versus narrative therapy. Does that make sense? I'm just trying to kind of show a little bit of difference between those. This idea, I think there's, yeah, I think I was going to look anyway. Those are some differences. And then if we jump from those to solution focused brief therapy, solution focus is super interesting. When I first started learning about it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so fascinating, because it's not focused on a problem. It's focused on a solution. And it's focused on helping clients generate solutions. Now, let me take a step back for a second. And this might sound like a weird question, but I'm kind of curious. What do you guys think the difference is between focusing on a problem, which I'm not saying is bad, sometimes we need to focus on that problem to work on it, versus focusing on solution? What's the difference to you? What does that sound like? Or does that sound different? What do you think?
I think focusing on the problem is a very negative viewpoint versus focusing on the solution is more a positive light. Yes, we need to acknowledge the problem, but then we need to go past the problem and acknowledge how we can solve or come up with a solution.
Okay. So one of them seems a little more negative than the other in terms of like kind of how you're looking at it. Okay, good. Anybody else?
One's a more proactive approach.
Yeah, how so?
It's making you do something, moving forward, rather than, I just feel like it requires you to do something.
Okay, gotcha. Take action.
Yes.
Okay, good. Yep.
I think focusing on a problem, I mean, just trying to, you can get to the point to where you're figuring out why that happened.
Right.
And then get into the solution of that. So it's like building from why this happened,
Right.
what the problem is, and then figuring out how to get to the solution and
Right.
be all right with this.
Gotcha. Right. Good. And we got a comment in here. Does this assume that the purpose of therapy is to solve a problem? Is that the purpose of therapy? We can ask that question too, right? And someone else is saying solution focus feels more forward moving, which I've heard people say. Right. Do you see this one of these as better than the other?
I don't see that it's better. I kind of feel like it's together. It's not necessarily better than one is better than the other, because you need one for the other to happen.
Gotcha. Okay, good. Good. They're not really better or worse, right? They're just different. It's just a different way.
Well, and I think it's dependent on the client and where they're at in their process of acknowledging the problem. They may not even be at that step yet. And so, like Nicholas said, we have to acknowledge there was a problem before we can come up with a solution.
Right, absolutely. So let me give you a couple of really specific examples of each of these in terms of just a difference between them. So when I work with teenagers, I use a lot of solution focus therapy in terms of like generating solutions. And there are ways to ask questions in terms of like, like I said before, kind of like, when was this not a problem, or when, what ways have you overcome this, or what ways have you, not had this happen? There's other techniques in solution focused therapy, like a miracle question, right? So you can say, or especially like a scaling kind of question I ask a lot. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the worst and 10 being the best, where are you right now in terms of your anxiety? Well, I'm a 10 right now. Well, last week you were, or I'm a 5. And last week you were an 8. Well, how'd you go from 8 to 5? And then they're saying, well, here's what I did. I did this, this, and this, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy would say, I have an anxiety or I have an anxiousness, let's say. Well, you try to find out if there's a trigger to it. And then we talk about specifically, like, when this happens and then this always happens. Well, we go back to the root of when something happened at the beginning. We figure out that there's a little distortion there, and we work on that distortion. They both work the same. They can both work the same. It really goes back to what I said earlier. It depends on what you believe in. Like, if you really like solution focused therapy and that's your thing, you're going to do great. Versus if you really like CBT and that's your thing, you're going to do great. Right? They're just different. Does that make sense? They're not really competing. We're all trying to do the same thing, right? We're trying to help someone in whatever way that looks like. And so to look at when we think about especially solution focused, there's a couple of things that happened when it was developed. At the time when it was developed, this kind of disease model was really, which is still prevalent, if I'm being honest. That's how insurance works. It's a disease model. It's a medical model. There's an issue, there's a disorder, there's a disease. We fix the disease. Solution focus was trying to look at it differently. We're trying to look at two things. One, we're trying to look at things a little more future oriented, a little more optimistic, and we're trying to work a little quicker than traditional, especially psychodynamic methods. Psychodynamic methods work really slow over time. Solution focus tries to work pretty briefly. Brief as in, typically brief means 12 to 20 sessions. That's what brief typically means. And miracle question is an intervention. An example of a miracle question would be, you go home, you guys get out of this class today, you go the rest of your day, do whatever you're going to do, you get ready to go to sleep tonight. You go to sleep, and during the night something changes. A miracle happens, and this thing is not there anymore. How would you know it's not there anymore? That's a miracle question. There's various ways to do that. But you're trying to find, it's kind of like narrative therapy in that you're trying to find exceptions to problems. In other words, problems aren't always there. There's times when they're not there. You're trying to highlight those and see them. This 6 session thing, that's like if you're a master therapist doing solution focused therapy, you can probably do 6 sessions. That's not very many. That's pretty quick. That doesn't often happen. The thing about solution focus that I like, and you can find this online too. If you go out and Google solution focused questions, you can find a couple hundred really good solution focused questions. They've done a really good job of really creating a really good library of questions to help people when it comes to the kind of the change process. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop there. Stop at that in the slides. I don't have time to get into all the rest of those. One of the things that's important as you start thinking about, since we're talking about questions, there's 2 types of questions that'll be the most powerful. It's a question that when you're asking what and how. When you ask people what or how, You're actually asking them to think through something and come up with an answer in a certain way. Versus if you ask why. They're just fundamentally a little bit different. So I had a instructor supervisor one time, we were talking, and I was talking about a case and talking about questions. He said, hey, ask them about this without using why. And this is when I was first starting. And it was really hard for me to do because you really want to know why, right? I mean, you want to say, why do you do that? Like, why is this happening? Why do you keep saying that? Versus, I wonder what it is about that it's, fill in the blank, or how does that, obviously you can ask how to feel, but how did you do that? How did you come across that? How did you start thinking that way? What things are happening that help you do this or not do this or whatever it is, versus why. When you can ask a what and a how, it's super open-ended and allows people this chance to process and chance to answer in a different way than when you ask why. And so I encourage you can practice this. You can start practicing this now with people. If you can, as you're having conversations with people, try asking them why a lot versus asking them what and how, and just kind of see what happens. You're not trying to do therapy with people. I'm just saying, just try it. It's just something that you can try out and see the difference, because there's a big difference between those things. Now, sometimes you are going to ask more closed-ended questions with people anyway, just to get information. Like if you're just trying to get general information, but as you dig deeper, what and how questions are things that dig below the surface a little bit more. And that's really important as you start thinking through working with folks. Next time our next class, I'll pick up, I think we're in chapter 3 or 4 now, or something like that. I'll pick up some skills things we'll talk briefly about, and then we're going to launch into things like working with families, working with groups, that kind of thing. We're going to kind of launch into some of those areas. I'm guaranteed to kind of miss some information just because there's so much. And so that's why the reading is really important for you. And so just make sure that you're kind of keeping up with those weekly readings. I try not to I don't think I gave you more than 2 chapters a week. I try to keep it at a couple of chapters. So, but the book's got tiny words, so it's a lot. It's a lot of reading. I think that's it. I don't want to jump into anything new because we don't have time. And I want to leave time for questions. So if you're watching the recording now, this is when we're going to have some question time. So if any of you don't have questions and you want to jump off now, that's great. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So I've been talking for like an hour. No one can hear me. Hey, that happened in a class one time. I was just saying, this is a time to ask questions. If anybody wants to jump off, you can. You don't have to. But if you have any questions about the class, about the assignments or anything,
I have
this is the
question.
chance. Yep.
I have question, but I have a question about EMDR therapy. It's little different question probably that you expected, but
Okay.
I actually see some, because I am finishing this semester my old theory part and I will begin pre-practicum in summer. So
Oh, okay.
I saw EMDR for fall, for training and everything. And I want to know your opinion. It's really a value, it's really working, because really, I don't know if it's really value, because it's like very popular right now, but what do you think about that?
You're talking about EMDR?
Yes.
So EMDR is like a eye movement
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
therapy. So EMDR was first developed in the military for PTSD, and now is mainstream and used a lot with trauma, victims of trauma and abuse. And so it is super popular. It is very effective. It's got really good, I don't know what the percentage of effectiveness is, but I know it's an evidence-based approach, but
Yeah.
you have to go slowly with it a lot of times, and you have to be able to really do really good therapy when things things come up from the therapy. You have to be able to kind of help them work through it. And so I think it's a really good approach.
Yeah,
That's
because I want
super
to
effective.
work with trauma issues, and I read
Yep.
that it's exactly related
Yep.
with trauma.
Yep.
And another question, if MDR is working only for adults,
For adults only, I think you said.
or it's working before kids? It's working only on adults, or if some age of kids can be using on?
That's a good question. I don't know. I would think in your training they would talk about.
I will begin in fall. I only paid.
Okay. Yeah. So contraindications.
questions.
Yeah. So it's called contraindications, where it's like, hey,
Yeah.
don't do it in this case. I don't know that. That's a good question. I know adults for sure. I know some teenagers. I know some teens have done it. I don't know about children. I wouldn't.
For teenager, it's already good, so it's a little more related.
I don't know the age. Like if there's a minimum, I don't know
Okay.
that.
Okay, I will read because I am actually want to begin like cognitive behavior therapist, and I find one training. It's rational living therapy. I don't know if you know. It's Dr. Aldo Pussy. So I begin training with him right now, and I want to jump in MDR. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's great. Whatever you're gonna do, if you get good training on it, that's what matters.
Yeah, I think too. So I'm scared to go to kids, for example, after trauma without any knowledge. So I'm trying to see everything that I can. So.
Yeah, because kids can't access emotions like adults and can't use their words like adults, and it's just different in that way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Yes, I have a question. So I just have someone. I was in another class. So where can I find this recording? Will it be emailed or is it going to be on Moodle?
I'll put it on Moodle. I'll put it on there today.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
It's actually on a YouTube channel that I have as a professor, but the link will be on Moodle.
Gotcha. Okay. And at the beginning of the class, that's when you talked about all the assignments and things like that.
I didn't talk about any assignments. I was waiting till now.
Oh. Okay.
You only have 5.
5 assignments. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll look at the recording and I guess email is the best way to reach out to you or
absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
Is it any specific instructions you can give us about our assignments?
Which one specifically?
I honestly haven't had a chance to even look through them. I was in the hospital whole week with my husband, and I was wondering, is it like something like what we need to know, or everything explanatory?
I think it's pretty straightforward. Y'all can tell me. The first 3 are questions that you're answering from the book, and then you're going to interview a mental health practitioner, and then you're going to write a reflection paper. So they're all listed on Moodle. It's up. Y'all tell me if it's straightforward or not. I think it is, but I'm not 100% sure.
I've looked through it. There is a document that breaks everything down with the specific questions. The expectations are all right there. The only question I have is like answering the questions based on what I understood is you do want it in an actual narrative, not just like, here's the question, here's the answer, and then you want us to use APA format throughout.
Yeah, I want you to basically have headings so that I can track where you're at. Yeah, for sure. And the APA part should be pretty easy, pretty straightforward, I would think, because you're getting it from the book, right? I mean, that's where you're getting the answer. I think I said something in there like if you wanted to go outside the book, you could, because there are other, you could find answers in other places. But if you do that, for sure, cite them, because most of the answers won't be your own answer, right? So citations are there to let the reader know that that's not your original thought. It came from somewhere else, right? That's why you have the citations. So, and you should have on that document, the due dates and everything too should all be there. And it's in Moodle too, but you should have everything. I tried to make all the due dates on a Saturday as best I could. I think I made them all on a Saturday too. And when it says due date, it can be like any time on Saturday. It doesn't have to be, you know, at 2 o'clock or 5. It doesn't matter, just any time. All right. Any other questions? Yep.
Yeah, I have one. How long do you want our answers to be?
That's a great question. So do you want me to tell you the realistic answer, or do you want me to give you here's a realistic answer. I have 108 students and I have a lot of papers to grade. So the quicker you can get to the answer, I love that.
Okay, like
The quick,
2 pages or?
Yeah, I cannot imagine more than 2 pages for. Now, some of those questions along, like the third one, there's a lot of definitions. So maybe that might be a little bit longer, but I think 2 pages would be fine.
Okay.
I think that'd be fine. I'm of the belief that, like, hey, let's get to the point and answer the question as quick as you can.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
I'm cool with that. You don't have to add a lot of language if you don't want to.
Sounds good.
Yeah. I'm not griping about having that many students. I just like to grade things quick so I can get back to you. It just takes longer, that's all. Any other questions?
I've noticed the you know, on the Moodle you have the reading schedule.
Yep.
It's a little bit different than the one when you posted the video for week 1.
Yeah, I was wrong. The video, I think I said 13 chapters and there's more than that. So I readjusted the reading schedule. I think I said 15 chapters or something.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
it's that. Yeah, go follow the reading schedule and you'll be fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. To be honest, I made that error right at the end and I didn't want to redo the whole thing. So I was like, oh, I'll just kind of let it go, see what happens. Any other questions? Or answers?
I have a question. You mentioned we might add a 4th Zoom class in. When would we know about that, I guess?
We'll know about that after this next one.
Okay.
Because it
Is
kind
it
of
more
depends
just
on,
we don't cover stuff?
yeah, just
Okay.
it's kind of like, and it will, and all of these are optional, by the way. You know, it's all optional, but I'll still record it. It really just depends on how far we go, how far we get through everything. So, but I'll know next time. I'll know for sure. It's interesting because before COVID, this class, we wouldn't be doing this. It'd just be online. You just be doing the assignments and I would still talk to you via email, but we wouldn't do video like this. So it's interesting. So I like doing this even for the distance classes, because I think it's a little bit better. It's at least something. I know face-to-face is one level and this is kind of a level 2 for people. So
I have one more question. I don't know if you addressed the midterm and the final on the recording. If you did, I'll look at the recording, but if not, are we gonna have a midterm and a final, and what would those look like?
we will not.
Awesome. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, I thought about when I made the syllabus, it was like 4 months ago. And at the time I was like, oh, let's do a test. And I was like, nah, never mind. Let's don't do that.
God bless you.
Yeah. I think y'all take enough tests. This will be all right. We'll be all right. So any other questions? All right. Now you can go do something else. And I will see y'all. When are we meeting again? Let's see here. The 2nd, April 2nd. All right. I'll put the recording up today and you guys have a good weekend.
Thank you, you too.
You too. Thank you.